Here is Visconti Sepia, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Moramon Nemesine notebook.
I have always loved brown inks, and this is a little lighter than I tend to prefer, but yet I love this ink and instantly want a bottle to love it even more. This is a very consistent ink, which frequently gives the same and consistent shading. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it still maintains the appeal that you want, and it makes you want to write more. Now, I'll say that what you're seeing right now is generally just a little bit darker than the writing samples, and it's from a wet pen. How could I not love and want a bottle of this? It's an amazing ink. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M800.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairefontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice mid-tone of brown with no feather, no spread. Very nice shading going on, thick and high all the time. On the first line, thick and high. The TH is very dark into the I. That C lightens up quite a bit, becomes very dark at the K again. Now, and starts light at the A, becomes much darker at the end of the D. And high starts dark on the H, lightens on the I, mid-tone at the G, very dark at the H again. Beautiful all the way. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as it did with the Clairefontaine. With the extra fine, I'm on Clairefontaine. I'm so excited, I don't even know what I'm doing. Look at they on the first line. That T is a nice mid-tone. The he in the middle is very dark. The Y at the end does lighten up a little bit, and ladders underneath that. The LA and beginning of the first D are lighter. Nice mid-tone into the Ds, lightening on the ER, very dark with the S at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit lighter in tone than the medium, or more, I want to say it's really showing off the lighter tone that the medium gave with a little bit of the darker tones. So it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. Yes, it does shade a small amount when you look at small on the first line, where the SMA is lighter than the L's that end it. But on the second line, the B has both mid and dark at the end of the B. It gets quite a bit darker, lightening into the U, very dark T at the end. Had we looked at had on the third line, the H and D are darker than the A and beginning of the D in the middle. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, I can continue writing with this beautiful brown ink back here. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 10 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. I'm not stretching to say that there's shading when you look at stretched on the first line, where the ST are darker than the RE. Now the T gets dark, the C lighten up, and the head at the end gets darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It still doesn't feather, still doesn't spread, still shades without a problem. Take a look at approach on the second line, where the A is a nice mid-tone, darkens up a little bit with that PPR. The OAC lighten up a little bit, and that H at the end, dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tiny bit lighter in tone than the medium, same tone as the Clairefontaine. No feather, no spread. It still shades without any kind of a problem. Look at Cliff on the second line. I just didn't have a way to tie that in. The CLI are lighter than the first F, which darkens up a little bit. It lightens again during the downstroke, but the second F becomes much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. We get to be happy all the time with this ink.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, showing it's being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning it's just a little translucent. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade about as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Taking a look at brought on the first line, where the B is darker than the R, which is a little bit lighter. Lightens again with the O, little bit darker with the U, little lighter at the G, much darker at the HT at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. Obviously, as a result of the tone of the paper. No feather, no spread. It did shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. There is a little bit when you look at there on the third line, where the TH are darker than the ER, but that last E does darken up a little bit. Looking at the stub nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feather, no spread. Does it shade? Yes. Very well. Take a look at torches on the first line, where the TORC are lighter than the Hess at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we're still happy because we can write back here while it has no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, it does stand out against this quad rule. It will make any teacher happy to see a teacher using this. It really shows this kind of classic from the brown that I enjoy so much. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, it does look great, and not by a little bit. Now, little, the first word on the first line, shows much more shading than most of the writing. I think a better approach to looking at it would be approaching on the third line, where the A is darker than the PPR, but the OA lighten up quite a bit. The CH get darker, the IN lighten a little bit more, and that G during the downstroke gets nice and dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. The same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. I haven't mentioned, well, I did with the extra fine. It does stand out incredibly well. Definitely worth some bonus points against this quad rule. So if you use this, your teacher's bound to go ahead and boost your grade. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Geherbon Caroube de Chypre. Here is Kaweco Caramel Brown. Here is Krishna Ochre. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Gold.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. Huge victory, as this paper often dulls it and lightens it a little bit, but oh no, it stays beautiful with no feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. Yes, it stands out against that quad rule with no problems. Definite bonus points. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, barely shades. Honestly, the shading is just minor. It's not really the thing there. The thing that I really see the most is this beautiful brown tone on the page, really. But the sepias are among my favorites. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread. Shading, yeah, it shades, not a huge thing, but it is doing well. Take a look at another on the first line where the AN is just a little bit darker than the OT. Now the H darkens up quite a bit and the ER is a nice midtone. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. Yay, happy notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is
Sailor Manyo Sakura.
Here is Noodler's General of the Armies. Here is Thornton's Orange. Here is Sailor Bungo Box 4B.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairefontaine. Now it does feather and it does spread, and it's not my favorite for it doing it because I know how good this ink is. However, I do think what you're seeing is usable and not the end of the world. Not what I would rush to use, but I wouldn't not write on 20-pound copy paper if this is what is in my pen, knowing this is going to look fantastic. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It still feathers, it still spreads, it still is usable on this page. It passes that functionality of I can read what's there, and the feathering and the spreading aren't distracting from what I'm reading, so it does come in with a win. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairefontaine. Minor feathering, minor spread. It is usable. It is rare that we will see an ink so consistent in tones on paper as we've gotten in this case. The only time I think we really saw a change has been from the toned paper. So what a huge win. Looking at the back of the page, though, sadly, I don't think you could continue your notes back here because the ink got quite deep into the paper, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath, making this still pretty darn good.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
This is so consistent that it almost always looks the same in tone and generally has beautiful shading. So naturally, this is a dealer's choice. You won't be disappointed, but it gets just a little bit darker from a wet pen and somehow increases my enjoyment as I'm using it in this M800 with a medium nib, which it's a wet pen and you get to see it. So that would be what I recommend. A bit wetter pen just to get that tiny bit darker. Well, this is a fairly wet pen. but a wet pen if you want that little bit darker. Though you can't go wrong with any pen. The tone is always beautiful.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.